So I wanted to touch upon the issue and problematic nature of IQ. Um, it has been studied and widely recognized that when it comes to a meritocratic society, which generally I would refer to as a free country and perhaps predominantly the West, where you have access to education and socioeconomic ascent through merit. Now, the two main predictors, and there's one clear winner in this. The clear winner in predicting socioeconomic success is IQ, or intelligence quotient. Now, first, it's worth mentioning that depending on who you um, believe, there's probably 8 to 9 different forms of intelligence. The problem is things like emotional intelligence are not possible to measure reliably. So IQ, which is cognitive capacity, that is the only form of intelligence that you can reliably predict. And therefore, when you can measure it, um, you can also have the correlation and causation in other fields. So it is IQ that is the greatest predictor of socioeconomic success. And the clear number two is conscientiousness. And the problems that we have with things like IQ is that those are genetic. So essentially, if you have two parents that are, let's say, quite intelligent or not, then it is quite likely that their child is also going to be more or less at the same level as the parents. While having said that, it is equally possible that you just happen to win the genetic lottery. Let's say both of your parents are below average in IQ and you just get lucky. And then you could be super intelligent. But also the opposite is possible. Um, that could be explained through, let's say, your grandparents or the generations before that. And there's a latent ability or latent genes that then suddenly activate for whatever reason. But kind of like height, IQ is something that, it is what it is, and you cannot change it in your life. For example, you can become more educated, you can increase your ability to understand the world, but that does not have an effect on IQ per se. So, and I think because it's an invisible trait, if you have somebody, let's say a 20-year-old man who's 2 meters tall and a 20-year-old man that is 160 tall, it is quite obvious for everybody that the guy who's 2 meters tall has a much higher likelihood of being a good basketball player, right? Nobody's really in their, clear mind going to dispute that. But because it's visible, it's something that's very difficult to deny. But when it comes to IQ, when you measure that, if somebody has an IQ of 130 and somebody else has an IQ of 80, that is a overwhelming predictor when it comes to the ability to get, let's say, a university education, advancing their career, making a lot of money. And the person with the 80 IQ, it doesn't mean that they cannot become socioeconomically successful, but the probability is very low. And anybody who is aware of the bell curve, which is a normal distribution, if you're at either end of that distribution, that's where you have the extremes. Now, when it comes to the problems of IQ, and I mean, it's well known in the psychological community, but the average person doesn't really understand that, is number one, the distribution of IQ in women is smaller, and with men it's broader, which means that at the very extremes, the most intelligent people on this planet are overwhelmingly men. And when we know that that is a predictor of socioeconomic success, you look at the Nobel Prize winners, that you can certainly say that they're high IQ and they're workaholics. The overwhelming majority of Nobel Prize winners, and now I'm talking more on the natural sciences, not the Peace Prize that you can get without being a workaholic, high IQ person. Those are men. It's not because of the oppressive patriarchy or sexism. No, it's just a result of men having a wider distribution in the IQ range. Similarly, you have the lower end of the IQ that are also predominantly men. And if you do the IQ testing in prison inmates, generally speaking, those are rather low IQ people, right? And more than 90% of inmates are men. So if we want to talk about equality, for example, just between the genders, you have this discrepancy in the extremes of the distribution. And that is just one thing that people generally don't recognize. Now, the other part of it is, and this is for a lot of people with let's say, an ideological bias, it sounds inflammatory or toxic. Now, what do I mean by this? Is there are genetic differences between people. So if you want to look at an organization like the NBA, and you, for example, you know that 13% of the US population are African Americans, but you look at the players in the NBA, it's like half or more than half of them are African Americans. So the overrepresentation of African Americans in the NBA is very visible, and nobody would dispute that. Now, how do we explain the fact that there is such an overwhelming, disproportionate representation of African Americans in the NBA? The only way to explain that is they have to have some sort of genetic advantage over, let's say, Asians or Latinos or Caucasians, right? And that could be explained by their muscle fiber having more ability to be explosive. They have a higher bone density. And this, by that I mean to West Africans, right? It's also when you look at sports like boxing or MMA, of course, NFL, American football, and basketball. So there is a genetic advantage in the West African gene pool for said athletic endeavors. And but saying that, it's okay, right? Because there's nothing racist about it. It's just a fact. And nobody's really butthurt about it. At the same time, when you look at, let's say, the Olympic swimmers, you don't see any West Africans there, right? Because of their higher bone density. Just means that they're more likely to sink, right? I mean, it's just common sense. At the same time, when you compare to, let's say, East Africans, they're really like Kenyans, Tanzanians, Ethiopians. These are disproportionately represented in, let's say, marathon runs. So they have lower bone density, they're taller and slimmer, so they're more adapted to running long distances. So there's a very clear distinction between different regions and related ethnic groups. Let's say East Africans, West Africans, and then of course the way we look, you look at, let's say, Native Americans, you look at Caucasians, you look at South Asians and East Asians. Now the tricky part is this. They've done IQ tests all over the world in all different regions. And the results, you can easily find them by looking online. Just saying it aloud, it's you're gonna get in trouble. But referring to what I said before, that there are differences, look at the number of Ashkenazi Jews that have gotten the Nobel Prize. They represent more or less 20% of Nobel Prize laureates. Now, there's more than 8 billion people on the planet. Ashkenazis represent 10 million, 12 million, perhaps 15 million. So we're talking about 0.2% of the population globally. So they have 100-fold probability of winning the Nobel Prize. And also when you look at billionaires in the world, there's a somewhat similar ratio in terms of Ashkenazi Jews being billionaires and the likelihood of them being wealthy. Now, how do you explain that? Let's go back to what I said first. IQ and conscientiousness are the two main predictors of socioeconomic success. When they've tested the IQs of Ashkenazis, their average IQ is 112 to 115 points. Now, the baseline of 100, that's done from a European or a Caucasian population, right? So that 12 to 15% discrepancy on average with the Ashkenazis means that on the normal distribution, the very end of the highest IQ people, there's a disproportionate amount of Ashkenazis there. So with that high IQ, it is very likely, and that's what we're seeing, is that they are more likely to win Nobel Prizes, they're more likely to be having successful careers, rich, etc. So just a fact, you can look it up. Now the second most high IQ group in the world after the Ashkenazis is East Asians. I refer to the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Chinese, and they are at about 102 to 105 IQ points. And like I said, Caucasians are at 100. Now, that's probably the best way to end the discussion, because if you're interested in everybody else, you can go look it up. But yeah, so that's my 2 cents on the IQ problematic, and yeah, peace out.